Good afternoon to everyone joining us from anywhere you might be located. My name is Emily Zayden, and I'm director of the Craft in America Center here in Los Angeles. And we are so pleased to have two artists from Southern California joining us today, Reuben Foat and Ryan Tabor. They are participating artists in our current exhibition, which is called Building Blocks. And you can check out the exhibition both online, if not in person. And it will be up through the end of August. And additional materials related to the exhibition will be forthcoming. The exhibition came about in part because we created a new resource called the Craft Video Dictionary in the last year. And both Ryan and Reuben were very helpful in terms of consulting to create that. And out of that, we have several artists who were filmed, featured in this current exhibition that is both functional to sculptural practices. And most of the artists participating in this show straddle both spheres, and yourselves included. So we're going to jump in today. We will have Q&A at the end of the talk, but we're going to begin with Ryan. So thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Emily. 1 second. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Emily and Victoria, and everyone else at Craft for making this happen today, as well as the exhibition and the video encyclopedia. I'm honored to be participating, and I'm happy to be here today. And thanks to Reuben for joining me in this conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice. My background is in fine art, and I came to woodworking and woodworking methodologies through researching historical woodworking methodologies as content in my sculptural practice. So it's a bit of a different approach. I haven't been formally trained in woodworking, and so everything I've learned is through working with colleagues and through teaching myself certain methodologies through material research to facilitate some of these sculptural objects that I'm making. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few different approaches that I've used in my practice over the last 20 years or so. This is a discursive practice. My undergrad degree is in performance and video, and I didn't really start making objects very seriously until about 2000. Then I continued to study new genres, and eventually I started making objects primarily, and by objects I mean drawings, paintings, and sculptural objects, as well as furniture and functional craft objects. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of the different methods or case studies in different projects, research-based projects that I've realized that have used furniture forms in different ways. This is really challenging for me to try and squeeze these bits out of a practice that is generally discursive and meandering, and each project informs another one through overlaid references. But with 20 minutes today, I'm going to try and run through just a couple of projects. So I'm going to start with this one. In 2008 or 9, I realized a large-scale body of work for the Torrance Art Museum for a solo exhibition there. And this was the first time I'd been building commissioned furniture objects for some private collectors, and I worked on a couple of corporate commissions, but I hadn't actually built any full-scale furniture that had the capacity to be functional, that had been exhibited or contextualized within my art practice. Before this, I'd been building a lot of scale models, using languages of scale modeling, and then also languages of sort of scenic modeling that we might see for film or theater to create three-dimensional representations of spaces that were predominant in culture through art that only existed in pictorial space. So I'm thinking about iconic paintings or scenes from films, and I would sort of realize these three-dimensional objects that would actualize these fictitious or constructed physical spaces of representation. For this project, I was coming back after taking about a year and a half off from making physical objects after becoming really ill from sensitization to certain chemicals that I was using that are common in the scenic industry and in scale model making. And coming back to object making for this exhibition, I wanted to work primarily with traditional materials associated with different craft practices that had lower risk exposure associated with them. And I knew that I wanted to make objects that were functional. I wanted to get the end of this exhibition and have absolutely zero objects that were going to go into a crate. So I worked with a number of friends and some collectors to request commissions from them. So this was a great experience. I basically found a home for each of the objects before I made it. And that actually helped dictate the design process. It was a bit like being on a commission with the client in terms of deciding exactly what the outcome was, objects that might fit. And then I began this process of realizing the exhibition. Now, I mentioned before that I have a discursive practice, and I really think of it as research-based. And what I mean there is that generally I'll be inspired by something. It could be a specific historical form of furniture or architecture, or a sculpture or a painting, and I'll start to research a lot of the other cultural aspects around the time or the place or the culture that object was realized. And then that will sort of grow into a larger body of research and work. And that research consists of looking at others' scholarly research, as well as sort of material research, learning a craft technique or experimenting with the material. So for this exhibition, I had been spending a lot of time when I wasn't in the studio outside, especially climbing rocks and ice in different national parks. And I was sort of fascinated by the aesthetics of architecture and furniture design that had been sort of overcoated with national political ideology to promote both westward expansion and manifest destiny, and then later on to actually promote and establish the national park system throughout the United States. In researching each one of these projects, I generally create sort of a constellation or a cast of different characters that are interacting. And in this case, I was sort of working with the architect Robert Reamer, or the concept of the architect Robert Reamer, who designed the Old Faithful Inn and then these old hickory furniture objects, and thinking about the aesthetics of rusticity and how it's been coded from right to then left to then right with political ideologies over the course of the last few hundred years. In looking at these different rustic architecture instances throughout the national parks, one thing that really caught my eye was I was looking at the parks in Yellowstone and in Glacier, and the mini Glacier Hotel especially. Now, this is just sort of a case study in how one of these bodies of research might go. In looking at this old documentation, I noticed there were a bunch of these Chinese lanterns that were used as decor inside, along with rustic furniture, artifacts from indigenous cultures, taxidermy, and it was really kind of fascinating to me how this was not only a anthropocentric view of kind of nature and what existed outside of the lodge, but also clearly a Eurocentric view that kind of flattened out cultural production outside of a hegemonic Eurocentric worldview and flattened it out and kind of equalized it with a Eurocentric or anthropocentric understanding of other forms of production that are not based with human intelligence. Anyway, I decided I wanted to work through creating this a language of sculpture that was teaming up taxidermy with these different traditions, craft traditions of making paper lanterns. And I had already been researching Sama Noguchi for a number of different projects. So this seemed like a natural fit. As I was drawing, I often make these drawings by using these PDF collages, or I did during this period. Before that, I was primarily making watercolors and graphite drawings that were very labor intensive. During this period, I was making these quick sketches. And one of the things I realized that I love so much about these Akari, these Sama Noguchi Akari lamps, is not only that they use these traditional materials and craft traditions associated with the Japanese tradition of Chochen or making paper lanterns, which had disseminated from Chinese traditions, but Specifically, that these objects also seemed to reference the architecture of space exploration. I couldn't look at these and not see lunar landers, satellites, rocket ships. And I started to think about the resonance or similarities between these rustic architecture spaces that were built on the edge of wilderness and different types of architecture that were being used in space exploration. So for this project, I'm not going to describe all of the threads, but I basically became very interested in Skylab and the designer Raymond Loewy, who had been contracted to work with NASA to establish some of the aspects of the interior living spaces. And then the end result, after a lot of research and then realizing the finished piece, was this installation, which had a large sort of display apparatus that was based on the 1939 World's Fair display that Raymond Loewy had designed. The footprint is based on it. And then we had these furniture pieces that had been commissioned. And then there's a scale model floating in here of the living quarters of Skylab. There's a giant mastodon tooth referencing the diluvialist belief in the giant of Claverick. Again, there's too much information to really get through in this talk. But all of this sort of informs aesthetic decisions that are made. And in the end result, I wind up with these assemblages. Now, none of the works that I'm making are or could be considered period furniture or replicas, exact replicas of furniture made during these historical periods. There's always something that changes. In this case, I'm using the strategy of assemblage, where I have these models of fossils that are built into them to reduce the functionality or remove the functionality. And then also these, rather than being used from hickory saplings, these are actually sculpted or carved out of reclaimed walnut that was actually in a burn pile that I rescued from a contractor. So the end result, though, is a suite of furniture that has a very textured and deep body of research around it. Now that research, as I mentioned, some of it is highly objective, and a lot of it is completely speculative and totally subjective. And that's sort of central to the core of my work, is this sort of marrying strategies of scholarly research with aesthetic strategies from art production and subjective decision making. Now, that's just sort of a kind of a little bit of background in terms of how I work and what a project might look like. That was, again, from 2008 through 2009. I'm just going to jump ahead to about 2014 and talk a little bit about the projects that are in the exhibition. The first project that is in the exhibition is we'll say it's a scale model of a set of metamorphic library stairs that were designed by the designer Sheraton and that belonged to King George III. The way that this piece sort of unfolded is that I was participating in an exhibition in Los Angeles where we were using reclaimed stormwood from the Los Angeles Arboretum. And I received a slab of material that was Eucalyptes botryoides. The common name is bastard mahogany. And as I started to research the species of tree, I found all kinds of information about Sheraton's advocacy to King George III to start using resources from Australia to replace the diminished mahogany resource that had been completely decimated in Jamaica and through the Caribbean. Now, I was really interested in Sheraton because, unlike Chippendale or Hepplewhite, Sheraton was not a cabinet maker. He was a designer, but really an illustrator. And so I was kind of fascinated in this case that this design, was realized by someone who didn't have the technical expertise to realize it. And I thought about the complexities of trying to build it just from this diagram. So this is one of the pieces in the exhibition. I used the material from the Eucalyptes botryoides to do basically all of the veneer work. The legs are solid, but the rest of it is veneer work over Philippine mahogany lumber core. All of the brass work and hinges and fixtures I fabricated. There are a few hinges that I actually sourced, and the casters were sourced, but everything else was fabricated by hand. The draws were made using lost wax casting, and everything else, all of the different mechanical components were machined using machinist tools. Now, if you look closely at this object, when you walk in, you'll notice the scale is off. And once again, I'm not really interested in building period furniture. I'm really interested in objects that sort of problematize the way that furniture exists in culture and the way that it's coded with different ideologies. One of the ways I do that is by changing materials or the working method or the scale to problematize that or signal that the intention is slightly different. In this case, this is realized as a model that's about 69%. And what this was these metamorphic library stairs. They were common during this period. And I was really interested in them because I thought they were a funny or interesting metonym for the way that knowledge functions in colonialism. I thought it was fascinating that you would have this library with all of this knowledge that had basically been appropriated or collected through colonization and the erasure of cultural identity in those colonies. And then by having access to it, but by having that access be able to be rendered opaque or invisible by folding the stairs up, then it made the user seem to have an omnipresent perspective. They had access to all of this knowledge without any work or labor involved. And I thought this was a really interesting metaphor for psychological strategies within colonialism, European colonialism. So this is a colonial eversion. And I'll just mention that, the eversion comes from a reference to the different types of sea stars that actually create an eversion by ejecting their stomach to digest their food before pulling it back into them. And so I saw this as sort of a direct formal metaphor for that process, being able to, eject these stairs and then pull them back in, rendering the process opaque or invisible. Now, as another signal that this is not just a straight ahead period piece, I also modeled a scale model of a redback spider web. This is a species that's invasive through Europe that was indigenous to Australia, where Eucalyptus botryoides was from. It was introduced through Europe through trade. The web itself is made from yak hair, which during the Georgian era was the primary material that was used for making wigs and powdered wigs. So I have just a couple seconds left, but we're going to look at one more project. Here's the redback spider. The other piece that's in the exhibition is based on the work of Tony Smith. This is one of Tony Smith's monolithic sculpture cigarette. It's one of the most iconic from his work in the 1960s. And the way that he made these projects was through making paper models of different platonic solids, octahedrons and tetrahedrons. He would work with his daughters, they would put them together, and he would find these strange forms that were semiotically and linguistically very slippery. This looks like a crushed cigarette. It has that semiotic reference, but it's made of these platonic solids. In researching Tony Smith, there were two things that I found that were really fascinating in terms of his biography. The first thing was, and I identified with this in reference in a lot of works, was an experience in 1951 where he drove down the New Jersey Turnpike that wasn't open yet with a number of his students in his car from Cooper Union as fast as they could drive with the headlights off. And he talked about this as this sort of experience that surpassed anything provided in culture or even in the abstraction of art making. The other thing I learned was that during his childhood, he was infirmed for about 9 years and lived in a small prefab hut behind his house with only a stove inside and a cot, started experiencing extreme isolation and really only having regular contact with a tutor and a nurse. And so I started to think about the way that, once again, we kind of deal with habitability or what we need in a space to live. And I kind of imagined how that would imprint on someone's psyche. And when I found out about the stove, I immediately imagined that perhaps the box stove that he had could have been a reclaimed Shaker box stove. So these are box stoves that were designed by the Shakers and were made in different forms from all the different Shaker communities throughout New England. And so what I started doing was breaking down these stoves by volumes into platonic solids, into octahedrons and tetrahedrons, and reassembling them the same way that Tony Smith would design these sculptures. And then I realized foundry patterns in pine, the same way that the Shakers would have realized these forms that would be sent out for their cast iron work for their stoves. And then here are the end results. These are the sculptures. One is on exhibition in the show. These are made of pine. They're foundry patterns. So the intention here is that they have the capacity to be used in this sort of liminal process to become functional objects. But at this point, they're in this interstitial space. Here are the two stoves I showed before, and then here are two more of these patterns. So this is 3 of 5. I'm realizing the next 2 patterns in the next few months. And over the spring, I'm actually going to be having these cast. I'm going to work with some foundries personally to have these cast in iron, so that they will have the potential to be actual functional objects. And I think I am at time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for covering so much so quickly and planting so many seeds of your ideas in all of our minds right now. So thank you, and we'll come back with questions. And so feel free, everyone, to type questions into the Q&A or chat so that we can address those after Reuben speaks. So you're up, Reuben. In the meantime, as you're queuing up, I just wanted to mention for everybody that both Reuben and Ryan are teaching professors at programs here in Southern California. Ryan teaches at Cal State University Long Beach, and Reuben is at Cerritos College. So that role of theirs as well as educators is very important, and we might be able to talk a little bit about that afterwards. All yours.
Cool. Thank you. I evidently can't undo my video. That's the God powers won't let me appear, but that's okay. You don't really want to see my face anyway. The work's more important.
We'll see.
So yeah, my name's Reuben. No worries. My name is Reuben Foat. I'm a faculty at Cerritos College in Norwalk, California, in the Woodworking Manufacturing Technologies Department. And here's a little show on the work that I've done. Sort of a brief introduction here. So I'm from a small town in Wisconsin. That's our water tower nearby my house where I grew up, Quantico. Lush green trees. I think the woods was definitely a serious impact on my life. And I think in a way it's interesting that I use them as my main medium these days, because there's not much for trees in California like there was back home. Looks like I have an auto advance, but anyway, this is my family. This is our 1.5 kids, Rami and Lou, and that's my partner. We get married in 2 weeks from today. Tammy, I know she probably doesn't like this picture, but I thought it was funny because we're all wearing plaid. So that's our little family. But now on with the show. So I am pretty obsessed with tambour doors. For whatever reason, I got introduced to them in graduate school at San Diego State University with a demonstration that Wendy Maruyama gave to an advanced furniture making class. And it's a furniture form that's unlike any others in woodworking. It slides in a track and then articulates around a bending corner. It doesn't move like a door that pivots or a drawer that slides in and out. And I think that was part of what was novel. This is an image of the piece that's currently on exhibition at the Crafted America Center in LA. And this is a more formal piece, but I'm going to talk more about what kind of inspires some of the work. Quick little history. Tambour doors were first started in the 1760s. This was a desk owned by Louis XV in France. He had the best stuff, and his cabinet shop would sometimes come up with novel things, and the tambour door was one of those novel things they came up with. As time goes by, the common person was able to have tambour cabinets in their home. I think we're all kind of familiar with this roll top desk kind of form from maybe mom and dad's house or grandma and grandpa's or great grandma and grandpa's house. I think there was one of these at my grandfather's house, and this is where you keep your bills and things like that in your checkbook, and it would have a little lock on the front of it. And of course, more common nowadays might be an appliance garage in the corner of our kitchens, but tambour doors are still with us nowadays. So like I was saying, this is a tambour door kind of rolled up. You can see slats there, and this is what I experienced when I first saw these being made in the wood shop at San Diego State, and I thought that was really cool. I have a bit of a traditional furniture making background, but I learned how to use CAD software, and when I was in graduate school, that CAD software became incredibly useful when I got access to a CNC machine or a computer-controlled router. And so it was one of those things where tambour doors, woodworking, CNC machines, they all kind of came together at the same time. And then, being in an art program, being encouraged to move beyond what I was comfortable making, and then being inspired by random things I would see. I saw actually a snake, not unlike this one. This is just from the internet, but swimming in a stream, and I thought that was pretty amazing to see the wake of a snake and then all of those sine curves moving. And so I wanted to make a cabinet of my own. Let's see, this video should work here. Maybe it won't work. But this was a cabinet I made in graduate school called Snake Cabinet. And there are these slats that have this repeating S shape, kind of like the wake of a snake moving in the water. And it just slides open left and right. There's 2 doors there. The video doesn't appear to be working today. But this is kind of what was novel about the making process at the time. So I'd be drawing this stuff in CAD software. I could draw half of the cabinet, and I would then be able to mirror the bottom half to have the top half match exactly, and then use the CNC machine to cut out profiles and tracks and grooves for interior components of the cabinet. And then using the CNC machine to cut out perfect slats that all nested onto each other in just the right way to make a cabinet that was different than anything I had seen before. And I was pretty much hooked. During that time in graduate school, I was traveling a lot, being from Wisconsin, go home and see things at the airport, like the conveyor belt at the airport. And I was seeing tambour doors everywhere. It's like, well, how could I make that? And so it's this process of exploring how to bring tambour doors from out in the world into my making practice. So here's a tambour cabinet, loosely a tambour cabinet. See if it works. This video one. Nope, not going to work. But back to that one. So this one, you turn the crank, it moves this little rack across here, and this spirals. And what I loved about it was this little slow down and speed up, just like the real one, the real conveyor belt, the baggage claim. And that was pretty awesome to make that one and to see that work in real life. And it's loosely furniture, but just exploring the medium. And then things like roller coasters. It's like, oh, it's like a train moving down a track. It's kind of like slats moving across in a timbre cabinet. And so this cabinet would have a track that the door would slide up and down all around. And I equated this one to, say, if you had compliments or criticism, that is your emotional state riding that roller coaster up and down. And then, seeing things out in the world is popular nowadays, and it was becoming popular when I was in grad school. These barn doors, how they would slide back and forth, and you'd bring those into your home, and trying to bring that into the furniture making practice. And here's another cabinet where I used bobbins to, this video is going to work, to be the rollers, and then have that navigate a little track across an open space. Well, maybe that's not working. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. Another thing that was novel anyway about the tambour doors was how it would roll up into the spiral like a sleeping bag. I grew up camping in Wisconsin and other places, and I love that little spiral. And there's something that was kind of common in my experience growing up. And you could do that with a tambour door, but then what happens if you had it in a cabinet? And this idea of a tambour door cabinet that would give up space but never its interior. And so this cabinet was called Retreat. This was a mock-up of it, and it was pretty cool. So I had to scale it up, and this was a scaled up version. And I made it about the size of a human, and this idea that if you're in a discussion with somebody who doesn't want to discuss the matter, they might give up ground, but never the interior. And here's another video that likely won't work, but I'll try. No. And it just, as the door winds in, the light becomes extinguished. You can't see any of the interior. The light turns out. And then as you wind it back out all the way, then light shines between the cracks. So that's what it looks like when it's, I guess, open. And there's some detail shot on the top. Some pretty fun details. I hadn't seen a 5-legged cabinet, so I had to make one. And there's the light casting out from the interior. So this was a cabinet where I actually got the hardware for the appliance garage. This is like a little bread box cabinet, and so you get this set from Amazon or a Mana tool at the time. And I was like, ooh, I'm going to try this in my timbre making experiments. And what was cool about these, they kind of slide together like elongated ball and socket joints. And I was, I'd play with them at my bench, and they'd be like little lemmings driving over a cliff. Let's see if I can get this video to play. So this cabinet, the slats would slide up a track around the back and then just drop an inch or so in the front. And so to gain access to the interior, you had to continuously engage with the cabinet. So it's called glimpse. There's a detail of that cabinet there. So some of it was, playing with the object itself, and sometimes it was just more formal things. Seeing dried mud, for example, in the desert here in Southern California, and wanting to put that motif onto the front of the cabinet. And then I called this the thirsty cabinet, and it was intended to hold a couple rocks glasses and your favorite bottle of adult beverage. And op art sort of opportunities where it's like, this is a 2D image and it looks 3D, but because of the way it's drawn, it's looks three-dimensional, and to put that onto a cabinet to be a decorative aspect. So that's a flat door, but the pattern makes it look three-dimensional. And then this is the more of the inspiration side of things. So waves in the sand, for example, I haven't figured out how I'm going to make this into a cabinet yet, but it's like I see these things and I see doors. How do I make a cabinet where one side of the door is a different profile than the other side? It's all about solving the problem, design problem, to figure out how that goes. Or being at the airport and seeing a conveyor belt with these repeating crescent-shaped belts that can move in a circle. How do I make that into a cabinet? This is at the Los Angeles Science Center. You can see the escalator moving inside of these cases they have for them, so it's exposed. I've never seen an escalator's underside. I need to learn more about that, and how do I make that into a cabinet? So this is the sort of the inspiration of where these come from. And this is something, shout out to my family, I think some of you are attending, is that only in Milwaukee, there is a sign that says recombobulation area after the security area. And so I think, I was standing in security at an airport thinking of all the people lined up there, like, slats in a timbre cabinet, and then all of us to be sort of torn apart with our stuff, as we move through security. So we're all discombobulated, and then there's an area in Wisconsin called the recombobulation area. And thinking about how would I make a cabinet about that, this is, how far I've gotten in this idea, but this cabinet sort of uses mid-century sort of motifs, and then like that one single leg at the front of the desk, there's more of a propeller sort of in shape. This is, this was a glow-in-the-dark 3D printed plastic that we had on the 3D printer at the school I was at the time. And I was thinking about how this would be a stack laminated sort of thing that was kind of popular in mid-century furniture forms in Southern California. And then what I would imagine is the door, as it opened, say around this open space, you'd say slide it out. And as the door came out of a small opening in the desk, the pieces would tip over and fall. However, they might as they pushed out onto the open desk space. And then as you close the door, the way the desk curve was shaped, they would all kind of start folding up and align and get back in order, and they move back into the cabinet in some way. But I haven't figured out how that happens. But I think the bigger point is the aspect of discovery and play and experimentation, which I so highly value in my making practice. And more with the discovery aspect of things. This video, hopefully this one will play, was an experience in that. This one is called surrender. So as the door opens, it goes into pieces. But when I designed this cabinet to go into the bucket, I didn't know that it was going to do that. And so when it did finally happen, it was quite the discovery. And I guess that's the thing that is really fun about making this stuff, is figuring out how to make it work, and then magic can happen periodically and blow you away. Anyway, this is my last slide. So yeah, I'm a professor here at Woodworking Manufacturing Technology at Cerritos College, and I like this slide just because it's our first hand tool and maybe one of our last hand tools. So thank you.
Thank you, Reuben. I'm so glad that some of the videos at least worked and conveyed how your tambour work. And I would invite anyone to also look at your website and other materials to see other examples in action. And if anyone is here close by, you will be welcome to actually see the piece at work in person in the gallery. So I think that's a great starting point. We have a question here, but the idea of kinetics for both of you, not something that we necessarily associate always with furniture, which is fixed and stable and more permanently situated in spaces. And so kinetics are sometimes overlooked, I think, with furniture, but not for each of you. Obviously, with so many pieces for you, Reuben, and then Ryan, thinking about your pop-up library ladder. So how does that play into your work and, you know, expanding your definitions of what furniture are, which are so expansive, of course? Either one of you.
Well, I guess go ahead.
Reuben, you are muted. I'm sorry, Ryan, you are muted. But go ahead, Reuben.
No problem. I guess one of the things that I think about often with furniture, it's kind of like you know, if like you know, the idea of two trees in the forest, if they fall, does it make a noise? This idea, in a way, that furniture, you know, as an object, isn't really complete until it's interacted with. I mean, it's the human aspect of it that makes it you know, have value and in a way meaning. And so I think that's the thing that I'm often thinking about, is the human experience of the object, right? And so in it, how, say, a door moves or a drawer slides, like that is intrinsic in the object, like us as humans understanding the object. And so that has to be considered. And so like if there's any like if it ends up being like a piece that's kinetic in somewhere, like that just makes sense. Like drawers move, doors move. It's part of it.
Yeah. Ryan, would you like to talk about your piece on that front? And
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have a number of pieces that I've worked on that have dynamic elements. I mean, in this case, it was really about like the potential or the capacity to transform. So it's not so much about demonstrating the actual movement as it is the capacity to exist in both states. And I see a lot. I mean, I see that as sort of a conceptual element in a lot of the works that I've realized that are furniture based.
exactly. I think that's probably an even better way to describe for both of you. They're both transformative approaches to furniture for each. So yeah. I'd love to talk a little bit about history, and some questions are coming in. And yes, there are rockers in our exhibition. This is true. So some of the isolated examples of furniture that do have that sense of motion to them, and a different level of interaction. But so you're both looking at history very deeply and in such different ways, which I think is fascinating, and what is great about pairing the two of you together, because your ends are very different. But I wonder how looking at history has also shaped each of you in terms of process in any close way. and how maybe you talked, Ryan, about not looking at replication really, but some aspect of making your piece was having to recreate. And certainly, Reuben, you have really reinvented and reinvigorated the idea of the tambour. So whoever would like to start.
I would say that, you know, in certain applications or in certain pieces, I definitely have tried to invest in traditional or learning the traditional craft techniques, histories around like the design and how the piece exists in the canon, but the ways that it was made, the tools that were used. And I use a lot of that knowledge in certain courses I teach at Cal State University Long Beach. We have courses that are primarily rooted in using traditional tools and handwork, and we look at languages of joinery across different cultures and different historical periods. So we're kind of looking at a survey of the technologies and then the abstraction of the forms that these technologies generated at the same time. But I am very interested. I think what I was trying to articulate when I was talking about the work, though, is that in creating these pieces that reference historical instances of furniture from the canon, the thing that I'm trying to avoid is just basically creating an exact replication or practicing period furniture. And again, I am very interested in that as a practice, and different craft people that primarily work in period furniture. I find it fascinating, and I'm really interested in it as a way of keeping certain knowledge alive. You know, in each object there's a certain degree of institutional knowledge associated with that craft tradition. But there's also sort of complexities in the ethics around celebrating certain forms that are associated with historical periods without critically engaging with the implications of you know, how other aspects of that historical period and what facilitated the means and the ability to create those pieces did in terms of, you know, all kinds of potential negative effects or even violence across different cultures.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking of sort of the historical aspect of you know, furniture making, is that, you know, it's like we're building upon what has like come before us, but I think there's sort of an aspect of what, at least what I'm interested in, is making stuff that hasn't been seen before. And I think I heard it described once, the difference between craft and art is sort of the craft's responsibility is to make the objects that people need, whereas, you know, art's function is to create the objects that the world needs. Or ought to need, and it's sort of this aspirational sort of idea, and I think there's something about this idea then of, say, design or furniture design or designing something that's new, is kind of starts bridging the gap between art and craft, where you're trying to make something that people need, but they didn't know they needed until they see it, and so I think there's something about making something that's really, you know, rooted in this craft medium, but it's something then that is new and novel and exploratory, and kind of shifts what we understand like those objects to be. And so that's, I guess, where I really find that value, where it's like I'm in this medium. I understand there's a lot of history. I'm looking at it. You know, there's design stuff I'm trying to bring forward, but I'm also trying to have a discovery and an experience like that on my own as well. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we share that very much in common with each other. What about, and I'm going to start jumping into some of the questions coming in next, but what about the role of history in your teaching, as far as conveying that history of woodworking to your students, and how much do you get to do that? Reuben, do you want to continue?
Well, I mean, I'm really glad that you asked this question. I mean, I think part of it is that it's hard to know all the stuff that's come before you unless you're really working hard to go after those sorts of things. I think we end up as makers finding something we're interested in and going and chasing that down its rabbit hole. We don't necessarily know all this stuff. I mean, we actually, because and something I was kind of curious about, we actually have a faculty member who started a history of furniture design course that's being offered for the first time this fall at Cerritos College. And so like excited to have that as a resource for our students going forward, because I think there's sort of this incredible value for knowing what has come before, so that you can understand why you're making, say, the choices you are visually or crafts wise when you're bringing your ideas to fruition. I think in our program, students, it's a lot of skills based. It's not necessarily delving too much into how it came in the past, though I think in a way we have some value with some courses that are like Windsor chair making or a traditional furniture making class, where in a way history or the way something used to be made is intrinsic into the content of the course, and so students learn skills that aren't necessarily contemporary but have high value for a making process going forward. That's just sort of the nature of our institution.
Brian.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's so important to find a balance between, the knowledge embodied in technique and actually like learning how to do these things that are, ostensibly the history itself, and then understanding this, scholarly perspectives and larger perspectives about different traditions, all the traditions associated with woodworking. We try and work through the curriculums at CSLB to tailor each class so that each class that's sort of focused on a specific set of techniques will also have a certain amount of content associated with craft theory and art and craft and furniture history associated with that specific period. So we kind of look at a synchronic approach where if we're dealing with, for instance, bending forms and lamination, we're looking at a lot of mid-century design theory and a lot of mid-century design history. If we're working with hand tools, then we might be looking at sort of a survey from over the course of 500 years, from much earlier period. So we kind of, I think it's really important, but I totally agree with Reuben. I think the best way to kind of address that historical content is to figure out a way to actually code it into the experience of making.
Yeah, perfect. And you both tap it in so many layers and ways in your own personal work. So it makes perfect sense that you would weave it into the curriculum at your schools. Let's see, I'm going to start with some of the questions. Ryan, would you say that you've developed your own vernacular works by hybridizing unlike cultures? I think your cultures are focused on American, but
I mean, yeah, in most cases, there are other cultures that are referenced. For instance, I mean, in the first piece that I was talking about, I was definitely looking at traditions of paper lantern making. But I was really kind of looking at it through the lens of the biographical details of Osamu Noguchi and his experiences sort of coming to terms with his identity as a Japanese American and understanding or trying to understand kind of exactly what that means in terms of a sort of tradition of historical tradition of craft lineages, but also kind of being one of the leading artists in the world that was working in abstract modernism. But generally in courses, I will say we teach a number of different traditions from other cultures, and that's always really tricky to kind of navigate that and make sure that there aren't really issues of cultural appropriation built into the dialogues around these different craft traditions. Often we'll have, for specialized techniques, we'll bring in specialized faculty that can kind of deal with the history of those techniques through their own practice that they've been trained in. But it's always tricky in terms of like creating an actual vernacular. I don't know that it, I mean, perhaps it aspires, but I don't know that the works actually reach that. And but I'm definitely interested in hybridizing these historical forms. Yeah.
Well, and it seems more you are reconceptualizing or reactivating these historic forms largely, I mean, Eurocentric or American traditional forms. And of course, American traditional forms is a hybridization in and of itself. So I hope that starts addressing the question that was raised. But yes, so thank you. How do you each feel your products follow the theory of form following function?
I think it's interesting because, in a way, when I'm making objects nowadays, it's like function's sort of a lesser concern. It's like, yeah, you should be able to put something in it so you understand that it's furniture role, I guess. But, in a way, I mean, yes, aside say from that like cabinet that I called thirsty or whatever, for like say a liquor bottle, I don't really think about the function so much. So it's like, um, so if I'm not going to think about the function so much, or I'm not so concerned about it, then it's like in a way I'm all invested in the form. And I think in a way what ends up happening with most of the objects that get made now, it's like I want it to be a succinct idea. It's like, I don't want all my good ideas into that one object because I'll just make more work. But it's like, it's a sort of an editing process of does it play to the original inspiration, does every choice kind of point to this like overall harmony for the whole entire object? I mean, I've taught the furniture design course here at our program a few times, and so we'd go through the elements of art and principles of design in sort of a crash course at the beginning of it, for students who don't have an art background. And so I've actually found that as I've taught that, I'm much more concerned with sort of those elements and principles in making work now. So they almost all are way more formal. And yeah, so it's like if function is going to be like the main theme, then I'll hammer that one home. But otherwise, I'm not so concerned anymore. How lovely that is.
Yet the function of each piece is central to them as sculptural objects too. So function is sculpture, if not
Sure.
utilitarian, and yeah, it's front and center with your pieces.
Yeah, that door better work good. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if the door bounces around through there, that's no good. That would block you from understanding the object's sort of meaning. But yeah, for sure. I guess there's that.
Yes, they do work beautifully and perfectly. Yes, and they are a tactile experience as much as, yeah, a visual experience. So interesting topic to ponder. Ryan, how about for you?
Yeah, I would say the same. If I'm designing a piece of furniture that's a straight ahead piece of furniture, I'm very much focused on function. But for the works that I showed today and that we're kind of talking about more theoretically, it's yeah, I would say that the function is often semiotic. So it's really just sort of about how these objects are able to create some sort of an abstract dialogue through their through the pastiche that's created. I was kind of fascinated by this question in terms of about Reuben, because the seeing or with I'm really kind of struck by the poetic of the dynamism, the specific patterns that are created. And yeah, I mean, it's the content is an abstract content, but it's completely rooted for me in some of those pieces in functionality, in the demonstration of that functionality. It was really striking.
I don't want to interrupt you, Reuben, if you were going to say comment.
No,
I
appreciate that.
Ryan, would you say then, my perception is that you kind of throw away the idea of form following function, and you're kind of questioning that in a lot of your pieces. Is that the case, or no?
That I'm rejecting that design principle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
because you're
in a lot of instances, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the forms are actually in a lot of the works, the forms are manipulated in a way, right? The form are compromised. Functionality is often compromised, and that's a way of establishing a critical position in relation to the historical furniture object in the canon. It's a way of distancing the object from the object it's referencing to create the ability to kind of think through critically conditions around its production, its history, and any kind of ideology that it could be overcoated with.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, and we get a lot of chuckles from your stoves, which are made of wood.
Right.
So, there's a lot of built-in irony with at least these specific examples, not the entire body of work.
Yeah, yeah. And again, at this point, they're really, the sculptures are based not necessarily on the stoves, but on the patterns for the stoves that were made in wood historically. Um, yeah, but I know there's certainly a poetic irony there. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, possibly back to you said taxidermy, I think during your presentation, it made me think of the objects you're making as sort of taxidermied versions of the furniture. So,
right, right. In suspended states of decay, perhaps. Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah. Sure.
antiquated knits or yeah, other factors.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. How do you think about woodworking in relation to origami as an expressive art? Oh, interesting for both of you. Reuben?
It's interesting. I mean, it's like growing up, I loved making paper airplanes. I think I had a book of my dad's that was a paper airplane book, and I made every single one. And so that was like my sort of first experience with sort of hands-on making, and with the essentialness of being able to just take a piece of paper and you make like an object that then functions of sorts. And I think, and I recall, there's an aspect of even with like timbre doors that, these slats are attached to a little piece of fabric and it folds. And I've, seen work by folks out there where they take basically triangles of wood and attach it to fabric. So they have this blanket that, it's got wood on one side, but it fluctuates and bends all over. And that was, it's got sort of an origami kind of feel to it. And I think, I think a lot of mediums in a design process will take paper or cardboard and use those as a medium to iterate on the design and try to get closer to what the thing might be, so they can make some decisions on what the shape and form is going to be. So yeah, I think origami as an art or a making integrated into a making practice is highly valuable, especially in mediums like wood, where when we mill it, we get these nice big flat planar things. It definitely would go towards origami quite quickly. I could see that working very well.
Yeah, I would say that both are definitely in a lot of traditions of woodworking, especially additive process of woodworking. Both are sort of dependent on articulations of geometric principles. Having actual volumes. In terms of its expressive characteristics, I think there's something really interesting about moving from a panel in both of these arts from a flat geometric shape into some sort of an articulated three-dimensional form that potentially has some sort of emotive qualities or representational qualities. I mean, I think that's pretty fascinating as a proposition in terms of their similitude in the beginning and then what they can each achieve. I mean, there are a lot of artists that are working with thin wood veneers, to create three-dimensional objects that basically function very similarly to paper and origami as well. So I think that they have a lot of similarities in terms of the use, and they're both made out of wood fiber. So
we are getting close to time here. There's another question or two. I don't know that we'll have time to answer, but we'll try. And I wanted to also just ask if the two of you have any questions for each other, since this is one of the first times that you've had a chance to interact. Any questions on that front?
I don't really have a question for Ryan so much as like it's nice to meet you, of course, but then I'm really curious to see this iron work that you do with the shaker stoves. I think that's going to be quite the adventure, and I look forward to seeing that work come to fruition. And let's put some wood in one and try it out.
yeah, that's the goal. That's the goal. Got to burn the scraps. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
likewise, it was great to meet you, and I really want to see some of those objects in person. I'm really impressed by the poetic, like the poetic and the dynamism was kind of. I'm remiss that I haven't had an opportunity to interact with one yet. So I look forward.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for today. And please let us know, anyone who's attending, if you'd like to connect for questions that we weren't able to address. And please come and visit the exhibition, either online or in person, even better. And thank you so much again for the time today. Such a treat getting to hear from each of you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Emily.
Bye.